Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Great Disorder, National Myth and the Battle for America, by Richard Slotkin. Narrated by Chris Sorensen. A violent order is disorder, and B, a great disorder is an order. These two things are one. Wallace Stevens, Connoisseur of Chaos, 1942. Flags are blossoming now where little else is blossoming, and I am bent on fathoming what it means to love my country. A patriot is not a weapon. A patriot is one who wrestles for the soul of her country as she wrestles for her own being. Adrian Rich, One Night on Monterey Bay, The Death Freeze of the Century, 1991. Introduction. Our country is in the grip of a prolonged crisis that has profoundly shaken our institutions, our structures of belief, and the solidarities that sustain us as a nation. The past 40 years have seen a steadily intensifying culture war, expressed politically in a hyperpartisanship that has crippled the government's ability to deal constructively with the problems endemic to modern society. Major crises like the financial meltdown of 2008 to 2009 and the COVID-19 pandemic, which in the past would have inspired a patriotic rallying of public opinion, have instead intensified our divisions and raised the potential for political violence. It is as if we are living in two different countries, a blue nation built around large cities in which many races and ethnic groups mingle and blend, prospering on a wave of technological change, sensitive to persistent economic and racial inequality, and willing to support government programs to regulate the economy and increase social justice, and a red nation of beleaguered smaller cities and towns and rural districts, whose people are resistant to the cultural changes attendant on an increasingly multi-ethnic society and changing sexual mores, aggrieved by the loss of employment and security inflicted by a heartless corporate economy, and disaffected with a government whose regulations harm their economic interests and foster secular values at the expense of religious tradition. The latter has generated a political movement, Make America Great Again, MAGA, whose angry passion and propensity for verbal and physical violence has altered the language and the conduct of American politics. Some of this partisan rancor can be attributed to the propaganda of well-financed special interest groups, to politicized cable news networks and internet feeds that lock consumers into ideological echo chambers, but it would be a mistake to ignore the depth of the passions behind the partisan split. The differences between red and blue America are rooted in culture, in enduring systems of belief developed over long periods of time, reflecting different experiences of life and understandings of what America is, what it has been, and what it is supposed to be. Each has a different understanding of who counts as American, a different reading of American history, and a different vision of what our future ought to be. For Blue America, the election of Barack Obama, the first African-American president, symbolizes the culmination of the political and cultural transformations that began in the 1960s. For Red America, Obama's election was an affront, a confirmation of the fact that the political power and cultural authority of conservative Christians were inexorably shrinking, as non-white people became an ever larger share of the population, and cultural liberalization continued to undermine traditional values. As Michael Gerson, an anti-Donald Trump conservative who served as speechwriter to George W. Bush, observes in his column in The Washington Post, a factual debate can be adjudicated, policy differences can be compromised, Even an ideological conflict can be bridged or transcended. But if our differences are an expression of our identities, rural versus urban, religious versus secular, nationalist versus cosmopolitan, then political loss threatens a whole way of life. National security expert Michael Vlahos, writing in American Conservative, argues that the effect of this kind of identity-based conflict is to condition the whole of society to believe that an existential clash is coming, that all must choose, and that there are no realistic alternatives to a final test of wills. Opinion polls taken before the 2020 election showed that 36% of Republicans and 33% of Democrats believed there would be some justification for using violence to achieve their party's goals. As many as 20% of Republicans and 19% of Democrats thought there would be a great deal of justification if their party were to lose the election. Given these terms of conflict, it is easy to see why so many political commentators have compared our era to the decade before the Civil War. Each side in our culture war appeals to American history to explain and justify its beliefs about who we are and the purposes for which our political community exists. They share the same body of historical reference, the stories we have accepted as symbols of our heritage. These constitute our national mythology, an essential element of the culture that sustains the modern nation-state. It defines nationality, the system of beliefs that allow a diverse and contentious population, dispersed over a vast and varied country, to think of itself as a community and form a broad political consensus. It provides models of patriotic action that enable the nation's people to imagine ways of responding to crises in the name of a common good. The irony and peril of our situation is that the myths and symbols that have traditionally united Americans have become the slogans and banners of a cultural civil war. The crisis we face is not an imminent threat, like Southern secession in 1861, the Great Depression in 1930, or the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Rather, it arises from problems endemic to the modern social and economic order. The economic and social disruptions caused by the globalization of the economy, the extreme inequality between the very rich and the middle and working classes, the growing racial and ethnic diversity of our people, the enduring effects of racial injustice, and the profound challenges posed by global warming and climate change. These persistent and interlocking problems cannot be resolved unless we can reestablish a broad consensus on the meaning of American nationality and the purposes of patriotic action. Failing that, disorder and dysfunction will become the normal condition of our politics, and our future as a civil society and a nation-state will be in danger. A great disorder turns to America's foundational myths to expose the deep structures of thought and belief that underlie today's culture wars. The first half of the book describes the historical evolution of the foundational myths that are most central to our national mythology. These are the myth of the frontier, which uses the history of colonial settlement and westward expansion to explain our national character and our spectacular economic growth, the myth of the founding, which sanctifies the establishment of our national government and its foundational texts, the Revolutionary Declaration of Independence and the countervailing legal structures of the Constitution, the myths of the Civil War, which offer conflicting versions of the moral and political crisis that nearly destroyed the nation, and the myth of the Good War, which celebrates the nation's emergence as a multiracial and multi-ethnic democracy as well as a world power. The second half of the book reveals how these myths have played through the culture war politics and the multiple crises that have shaken American society since the 1990s. This book is based on more than 50 years of research on the creation and development of American national myths, which began with my study of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?